The entirety of the national American news media, this news organization included, are staking out the Justice Department and Robert Mueller's office in anticipation that the Mueller report will be submitted any day now. Here are some pictures the Associated Press snapped of Robert Mueller on his way into work early this morning. Here's a tweet from 3 o'clock this afternoon noting that Mueller never came out for lunch, even though he usually does. Speculation abounded about Attorney General Bill Barr's visit to the White House today, even though the president wasn't there. Politico's Jake Sherman pointed out that someone flew a DOJ jet to London Tuesday, but why? And as we stand right now, there's no Mueller report to speak of. Joining me now, Julia Ainsley, NBC News national security and justice reporter. She's been camped out at DOJ again today. What do you got for me today, Julia?
Chris, I thought I would come back with it today. I really did. I thought this might be the day. It was not the day. And we're told that the Attorney General really does operate around normal business hours. So I don't think it's going to break tonight or overnight or in the middle of your show. But we'll be on standby again tomorrow. One thing I'll tell you tonight that I wasn't quite sure if we could say last night is that we do expect in the national media to know when the Attorney General gets this report, and then to know again when he transmits his briefing to Congress. At first, because it isn't outlined that he has to tell us, we weren't sure if he would. We do now expect that.
I see.
But I think what's more important, there is a lot of drama. I could give you all the color about the angst inside this press room and the pressure on all of us. But I think what's really important is to figure out what this means when it does come. It'll be a binary thing. He has it. We won't know much more than that. But what that does mean, and we were able to confirm this today, is that Robert Mueller's job will be over. They will be able to close up that office. Even if parts of this get spun off into other investigations, his job and his funding will end when that report comes. I think that is fundamental to remember.
I don't think I quite knew that. So your understanding from the Department of Justice is when that is transmitted to the Attorney General, that is the end of this special counsel's office, not just his investigation.
Yes. They could, for example, we know that Roger Stone still needs to go to trial in November. So they could move that over to another, for example, the U.S. Attorney in D.C. could handle that. Right. But essentially, the end is the report, and that's the end of the funding and it's the office as we know it.
So final question. It's not a totally like some sort of collective mania or delusion that has people thinking it's coming any day now. Is it? I don't know. I'm not convinced, I guess. There's some data, there's some information to suggest this?
There is. I'm glad you asked, because I think that people on Twitter just think that we're all just wrapping ourselves up into a frenzy. They might have something to that. But no, we have, I think, whether you're a Justice Department reporter, White House reporter, or Capitol Hill reporter, there have been strong signals from people in a position where they would need to know, because they would need to be ready to receive this report and respond to it, to tell us to get ready, that we are now on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour wait. Okay. So I know people think that this is a crazy fool's errand. As of now, we're not told that it is.
Julia, if you and I are having this conversation in 6 months, I'm going to play back this tape. I'm just telling you. Okay. It's on camera.
Fair.
Thank you. Julia Ainsley, thank you. Today, former FBI Director James Comey wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post arguing Americans should not hope for a specific outcome from the Mueller report, only for maximum transparency about the special counsel's work. Meanwhile, former Acting U.S. Solicitor General Neal Katyal has provided 5 rules for when news about the Mueller report comes out, and Neal Katyal joins me now. All right, Neal, what are you looking for? How are you thinking about it?
Well, I'm thinking about it. The most important thing, and it's fitting that you had Julia on right before me, is transparency. And it's what Jim Comey has written about, too, which is, this is one of the most sensitive investigations in the history of the United States. Parts of it have already implicated President Trump in direct wrongdoing, the Southern District investigation that has said that he orchestrated the commission of campaign finance felonies. So given all of this backdrop, given the fact that there have been so many guilty pleas by the president's top inner circle folks like Michael Flynn and the like, I think transparency is the most important thing we should be looking for. We need to see what the Mueller report says as Americans.
Isn't there a lot of latitude, though, in that transparency? It's still unclear to me what the parameters or boundaries of most or least transparent are.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The special counsel regulations, which we wrote in 1999, were written in general terms because they were written for a variety of investigations, not just investigations of the president, but lower level officials, and not just crimes necessarily like, the most serious, like conspiring with Russia, but those could be even garden variety, in which you might want a special counsel if there was a conflict of interest or something like that. And so, I think the regulations themselves don't squarely require the disclosure of every jot and tittle of the Mueller report. It's more the animating spirit behind them and our rule of law, which is the idea that when you're talking about the nation's most powerful man and the person who controls the full prosecution power under our Constitution, you've got to be more forthcoming.
There's always, of course, because there's a counterintelligence aspect to this, and I've dealt with this as a reporter many times, classification, national security is just the easiest way to throw things underneath a blanket. And no one gets to see it, and no one gets to even, on the press side, appeal it. How much of that is going to be a challenge, you think?
Right. I think it is a challenge. Now, look, I am a believer in those redactions for national security reasons. Sometimes there are sources and methods that are important to protect, and you don't want them released. At the same time, I'm very worried about this administration, which has so abused the national security card, it's going to make it hard for it to have any credulity in the courts or in the court of public opinion for years to come. So, I very much hope that Attorney General Barr looks at this very, very carefully and before he invokes any sort of privilege, because nothing could be worse for the American people than a cover-up or a cover-up of the cover-up.
I wanted to ask about points 2 and 3 in this thing you wrote about the scope, what the scope of the report is, and whether the report is limited to criminal acts. Why are those things you're thinking of?
Yeah, so first of all, remember Mueller's mandate is really a criminal mandate, and possibly also some aspects of counterintelligence. But there are a whole variety of things that have come out in the course of the investigation and other investigations that aren't necessarily criminal. Take, for example, President Trump saying during the campaign in 2016, "I've got no business dealings in Russia." We now know from the investigation that that isn't true. That's not a crime to lie to the American people, but gosh darn it, it's a pretty significant thing that the American people need to know about. So when we read the Mueller report or whatever the Barr version of it is, we got to know what the limits were. So that's one thing. Another is there are all sorts of investigations that Mueller has given to other offices, most notably that campaign finance investigation in the Southern District of New York. The Mueller report may not deal with that at all. And so even if the Mueller report were to conclude, for example, the president didn't conspire with Russia and didn't obstruct justice by firing Jim Comey, that may not get Donald Trump off the hook when it comes to these very serious crimes out of New York.
Okay, but here's the thing. So that thing you just said, I think about this sometimes, right? The normal way you think about criminal prosecutions is you either indict or you decline to indict, right? You pursue the charges or you don't. And if you don't pursue the charges, you don't say, this person is hereby exonerated. You just say, we don't have sufficient evidence to pursue it. But this is such a weird, different circumstance. The president can't be indicted according to the old OLC decision and a lot of the way people think. Let's say he can't. Then what are you saying, right? You can't make a declension decision here.
Right. So first of all, even in situations that don't involve the president, sometimes you actually do go further. Think about the Ferguson report, for example, in which there was no indictment, but a long description of the events and a lot of facts presented. Here, it seems to me the case for disclosure is at its height because we are talking about the president who controls the prosecution power. So the only way the public can have confidence in the prosecution, in the investigation, because the president controls the investigation and he already fired one investigator, Jim Comey. So the only way the public can have confidence that an investigation was thoroughly done is by release of the report. There is no substitute for that.
All right, Neal Katyal, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.